Some of you may not be aware that in the 1950s and 60s and through to the early 1970s, there existed something of a West Coast mafia inside the history department at the University of Canterbury. The godfather of that particular mafia was, of course, Philip Ross May. The good members of the history department who did not belong to the West Coast mafia tolerated us very quietly and politely, as Cantabrians always do. But let me tell you a few tales to begin with, I guess, about how this mafia tended to operate in the 1960s. I should point out also that members of that mafia are in the audience. John Rosanowski there has probably not admitted to being part of it, but indeed he was. I have in my mind's eye two things about Phil and the sort of mafia tendencies that developed inside the history department. The first one consists of a little cameo of Phil and the rest of us, four of us, headed by an Englishman who was the professor, and we were sitting deciding the final grades for that year's several hundred students. Phil would always sit to one side as if he was distancing himself from a very unfortunate experience. He didn't like judging people really, but he would sit and he would have in front of him a box. This box consisted of photos of all members of the class. In those days you had to fill in one of these cards. We would be discussing the grades for a particular student, and suddenly a voice from the side would say, "She's a lovely West Coast girl." To which the chairman would say, of course, "Well, nothing more needs to be said." The second thing I'd like to recall is that Phil, of course, loved the West Coast, so that the West Coast Mafia was really a sort of a name that was given, part in jest, by the department for Phil's activity in constantly proselytising, constantly seeking out students who might do a little bit more here and there on the West Coast. So in 1976, it was as part of this, his sort of mafia role, that he pointed out to us, as he often did, some things we'd missed about West Coast history. One of these was that we'd missed the fact that Hokitika and Greymouth were roughly marathon distance apart. And he said, in fact, they'd been created deliberately at that distance for that precise reason. And what sort of West Coasters were we if we hadn't actually run the bloody thing? So in December of 1976, a group of us decided to accompany Phil and run this particular race. That year it was from Greymouth to Hokitika. Phil was already unwell, it happened, and he said to us, "Well, look, I'll run with you for sort of 15 miles, and then it's up to you." So he did that gloriously, and that 15 miles was one of the most classic illustrations I've ever seen of a person deeply in love with the place he was traversing and the people he would have met while he was there. And as we travelled along that 15 miles, me gasping, Phil was constantly talking, pointing out little landmarks which we may have missed. And in our midst, there was the back of our group were a couple of Aucklanders who had lots of questions. Phil was also a great practical joker. So his explanations of the West Coast as we travelled along tended to get more and more shady, which makes me think that perhaps John was right, that indeed crime is the area we should be studying. But Phil, of course, was to tragically die within about 6 months of that run. But it struck me then, and it strikes me now, that I haven't met any historian so proud of the place he came from and so dedicated to writing about it. For those of you who don't know much about him, let me tell you in broad terms his career. Philip Ross, as he is always called in publications, was always proud to proclaim himself as coming from Ross, the Ballarat of Westland, as he was later to call it. And his father had for more than 25 years managed a timber mill there and served several times as mayor. Phil himself was born in Hokitika. I'm sure he would have preferred to have been born in Ross, but he could never get away with writing that down. He was educated, though, at Ross Primary School and Greymouth Technical High School, before, like so many of us afterwards, going over the hill to Canterbury College in the late 1940s. And in 1954, he was awarded an MA with first-class honours in history after completing a thesis which was called The West Canterbury Gold Rush to 1865, the analysis of a gold rush of the mid-19th century. On that run that day, he mentioned he still bloody wished he hadn't called it the West Canterbury Gold Rush, even though it was technically correct. After a time as a high school teacher, of course, he joined the history department staff at Canterbury College, as it was called then, and it was there that he wrote the path-breaking West Coast Gold Rushes in 1962. Now, that's a cameo of it all, but I think we can draw some very interesting sorts of conclusions from looking at Phil's career a bit and at the way he wrote about the West Coast. His arrival, if you like, as a historian coincided with, as you will have worked out, the West Coast's centennial moment. In late 1959, the Mayor of Greymouth at that time, Fred Bailey, was greatly concerned about trying to organise the centennial year of 1960. And as part of that was published a small booklet called Westland's Golden Century. Now, 1960 was proclaimed, in fact, a centennial year on the West Coast. And those of you who grew up, as I did, at that time in Stillwater, will recall that 1960 was a real fun year. Because what happened, of course, was that there were dances up and down the coast at unlikely places now, it seems, like Atterau, Blackball, even my own Stillwater, which now no longer has a hall at all, at Dobson and at Ahowra. And of course, it was a very exciting year because you could go to these dances, celebrate the centennial year, whip home on the bus from the dance up at Blackball. There were special buses for you. Get home, turn on the radio, and you listen to Wilson Winneray and the All Blacks in South Africa. It was a great year. Well, that Westland's Golden Century, that booklet that was part of that year, you can see in it the beginning of Phil's writing. He writes there 3 chapters, one called The Exploration and Purchase, another, The First Gold Discoveries, and then another, The Year of the Rush. And they, of course, were followed, as I've already said, by the West Coast Gold Rushes itself. A massive book, of 588 pages, gave a very detailed description of the West Coast and its foundation years, with nearly 100 pages of it really devoted to the exploration and mapping of the region before the rushes of 64 and 5. And its 2,000 copies, at first printing anyway, were sold out within 3 months. It was selected by the New Zealand Literary Fund as one of New Zealand's books to be displayed at the International Book Design Exhibition in London in 1963. And when Hokitika came to mark its own centenary, the following in 1965, Phil added some work to chapters in that book, and it became a 48-page booklet called Hokitika, Goldfields Capital. In short, it would seem to me that by the time I went over the hill and began going to university, it would have been quite correct to say that as New Zealanders understood the West Coast, the only way they understood it would have been through Philip Ross May and the West Coast Gold Rushes. And if I need to remind you, I can perhaps capture the essence of what he had to say by quoting you very briefly the exhortation at the end of his book. Caused a lot of ruction in some circles, but it's a wonderful exhortation. It says, "Motor up the Waimea some frosty night in June. Take your stand on the slopes of Scandinavian Hill. You'll find Jimmy the Slogger and Liverpool Bill, Gentleman George and Yankee Dan, all hard at work. The gullies echo to the ringing shovels, and the picks go flashing in the moonlight." Wonderful stuff. Although, as I may remember to tell you later, some other West Coast writers took a different view. Above all else, I think, that passage at the end of the book tells you all you need to know about Phil's attitude to the West Coast and to the task of being an historian. For him, I think the heartland of his historical research was always that 17-mile radius around Hokitika. Phil was a coaster born and bred, and what he followed when he was studying the West Coast and studying the Hokitika goldfields, what he discovered and what was to be extremely important inside the university circles, although slow to be acknowledged, was that those who entered into local history research could not avoid looking further afield to understand what they were seeing unfolding before them. And so when Phil looked around the gullies and creeks of Ross, he became aware, I think, that he was looking at the seasoned veterans of goldfields from other lands, the goldfields of the Pacific borderlands. He was looking at people who were, as modern historians might call them, transnational figures. They were people who learnt skills, tried to understand their goldfields in one community, and then found themselves washed up on another. So Phil's book was very much, I think, about observing and understanding how this veritable army of diggers from a variety of places came to grips with the land over which they passed and tried to tap its resources. So for a historian, that always seemed to me to be a great insight, which, and I'm going to say this shortly, was sort of lacking in much that was done in New Zealand history in the 1960s. And if you want to see that particular thing worked out, you only need to read all of Phil's books, and most of them are here. Gold Town, 1970, which looks at Ross. The Origins of Hydraulic Mining in California, from 1970. On the Mother Lode, another Californian book, 1971. And various essays in shorter publications. But in all of those books, Phil was coming to grips with the essence of human existence, it always seemed to me, if that doesn't sound too posh a phrase. He was looking at the way in which, by comparing the rushes of the Pacific borderlands, we might better understand ourselves and better understand also the way in which gold rushes work. Now, importantly also, I've made much so far of saying that Phil was, of course, a great man who, through his local preoccupations, was able to glimpse wider visions. But at the time he was actually writing, very strange things were happening in New Zealand history. Very good things, as it turned out to be. Those of us who went to university, like John in the 60s, as I did, would have been confronted by a corpus of New Zealand history which pretty much told us that our history was to be written as a replica of things English. That indeed the dominant theme in New Zealand history, as we might best understand it, was to do with the silken thread of empire. Now, when Phil was writing, that's pretty much how historians looked at New Zealand history. So, to take up a West Coast topic and to write about gold rushes, we would think nothing of it today. But let me tell you how that would have played out in the history department at the University of Canterbury in the 1950s. And there are many people who would tell this story, not least Pat O'Farrell. But fundamentally, you would have been confronted with a professor of history, and I can say this publicly now because his own son has said it, who indeed was not in the slightest encouraging of anything to do with New Zealand history. New Zealand history was something that, well, at a pinch, mind you, second-rate students might do. And so, let me quote Pat O'Farrell, another good West Coast lad, who confronted the professor of history and said he wanted to write about the West Coast labour movement. This was in 1953 or 4. Wow. The response? Well, if you will write about a second-rate subject, the outcome will be second-rate also. Now, I make these points because we sometimes, when we look back at the work of sort of earlier historians, we don't quite understand the context from which they are looking at these things. So the mere fact of wanting to write about, in Pat's case, the labour movement of the Grey Valley, in Phil's case, the gold rushes of the West Coast, and if you want examples that get away from the coast, Ned Bowen, in a book he's written recently called Singing Historian, about his own experience in the history department, he had been designated to write a thesis about a by-election in the East Midlands of England in the 18th century. Ned preferred, modestly, to look at an 1878 general election in New Zealand. But that too was considered pretty risky stuff. And indeed, my own version, when I was confronted with exactly the same proposition and wanting to carry on from where Pat O'Farrell had finished, I went through the same conversation. But now I was told, well, yes, go and talk to Phil. That was always it. No encouragement whatsoever, but go and talk to Phil. Which was, of course, the most wonderful thing anyone could have told me. And I learnt a very great deal from having done that. But let me also look at the way in which those historians, since once they got, I suppose, into the history department, what actually could Phil and, to some degree, Pat O'Farrell, actually try and do in encouraging people to adopt or to study the West Coast, to study New Zealand things. Well, what Phil did, of course, was to grab every single West Coast student he could I suppose, including you, John, is that right? And in fact, encourage us to the extent of almost sort of whipping us into line. There was a certain extent Phil would always say, well, you know, it's an obligation to study about the West Coast. Not that I needed any. But it seems to me then that when we look back at the West Coast Gold Rushes and when we read it again, we need to be thinking that what Phil did in that book, what he achieved in writing that book, was not simply and only, although that was very important, to write a wonderful study of the period of West Coast history, but also his book, in fact, was a constant challenge to those in places of authority in universities that the days of New Zealand history being simply a pale imitation of things that were being done in Britain was over. That in fact, this was something New Zealand historians should take to heart. That their own history was to be found, in Phil's case, in the gullies around Ross, in my case, around Stillwater railway yards and coal mines, and in Pat O'Farrell's case, amongst the Irish community of Greymouth and the labour movement that grew up around it. So it seems to me then that when we get to the end of Phil's book, next time we read it, we should observe that that exhortation at the end actually is, in fact, a challenge to historians to, when they go there in search of Jimmy the Slogger and Liverpool Bill, Gentleman George and Yankee Dan, that that's not just an invitation to enjoy the coast. It's much more than that. It's an invitation to take part, I think, in the search or the quest for finding out about how human beings sort out their existence in new lands. Thank you.